So to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Sean Murphy was born and reared in Dublin and came to live on Cape Cod in 2005. He has a passion for his homeland and loves to share his knowledge and interest about his heritage through classes, workshops, and conversation. Sean worked as a math teacher in public schools until he retired in 2017. He is a teacher of Irish history, music, and dance. Over the past 12 years, he has taught courses at the Irish Cultural Center of New England in Canton, Cape Cod Sons of Erin, Cape Cod Cultural Center, the Cotuit Center for the Arts, and at venues on Nantucket. In 2014 and 2019, Sean was awarded the Thomas P. McCann Altruism Award trophy by the Cape Cod St. Patrick's Day Committee for his support and commitment to the culture and heritage of Ireland and its people. Sean, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Heath, and welcome everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. So to give you an idea of what's ahead for you, I'm going to give you a history of, as it was announced, the life and times of St. Patrick. So I'm going to be looking at what was going on in the world. I was going to look at what's happening, what happened in Ireland, and the main events that were happening in the world are the known active world at the time in Europe, where the decline of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity. So we'll be looking at St. Patrick in that context. When I grew up in school, we learned about St. Patrick, and we were told, we were given essentially just a straightforward Christian church narrative. A lot of stuff about snakes, a lot of stuff about miracles, all sorts of things that were, as we now know, just a church narrative, not historical. And a lot of it wasn't even true, as I'll be explaining tonight. So with that being said, I'm going to move on to the presentation. It's going to take roughly an hour, and I'm going to be sharing my PowerPoint presentation with you now. And if you need a copy of it or like a copy of it, just let us know at the end and it will be available. It'll just take me a couple of seconds to get the screen up. So here we go. So I'm starting off with a little bit of a quote, and it comes from one of the works that is accepted as having originated with St. Patrick. We don't have the original, but we have a copy that was written in the 7th or 8th century. And this was from one of the two documents, the document that we know as the Confessio, which is the closest to an autobiography. And I'll be explaining later why he wrote this. But this is how he started it. He said, "I am Patrick, a sinner, most uncultivated and least of all the faithful, and despised in the eyes of many." So I'm going to be unpacking that for you. There's a lot in that. And when you understand the context in which he wrote this letter, a lot of that will become clear to you. So I'm going to start off a little bit about his family, because when I was growing up, we were never told anything about his family. And I'm going to stick to his siblings largely, and other parts of the family. If you go to places like Newfoundland and Australia, they talk about Patrick and Sheila. And the belief is that Sheila, whose anniversary historically was celebrated the day after St. Patrick's Day, that Sheila was in fact his wife, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. So when I introduce Patrick, the first thing I tell people, he wasn't Irish and his name wasn't Patrick. His name, in fact, was Maewyn Sacat Patricius, and it was from the Patricius that he got the name Patrick. Now, Patricius was an honor title that was given at the time that he was made a bishop. And so he came not from an Irish family, but from a Romano-British Christian missionary family living in Britain. On the west coast of Britain, we believe. He's one of the apostles of Ireland. Sorry, he's known as the Apostle of Ireland, and he is one of the primary patron saints, along with St. Bridget and Columba. We don't know for sure where he was born, but there is a lot of speculation that he was born around 385, probably in Kilpatrick, near Dumbarton in Scotland. There are other people who believe it was Wales. In his writing, he actually tells us where it was. He says it was in the village of Banaventa, Bernia, but no one has ever been able to figure out exactly where that related to. Now, his parents were called Calpurnius and Conchessa, and they were part of the wealthy Romano-British living in Britain in charge of the colonies. The Romans had first arrived in Britain, because at this stage it was just Britain. There was no England, there was no Wales, no Scotland. All those names came much later. So it was just Britain. So the Romans had come about 50 BC, and they had made some deals with some of the chieftains, because at that stage most of the people on the island of Britain were Celts, or related some way to Celts. Now they arrived about 100 years later, and they took over. They led a conquest of Britain. So by the time that Patrick was born, they had been in Britain for what, 300, 400 years, 350 years. So Calpurnius was a deacon, and his grandfather was a priest. Now, there is evidence that some of his siblings and their offspring worked alongside him in Ireland. For instance, Saint Mel of Ardagh, and his brothers Melchu, Munis, and Rioch, and they accompanied their uncle Patrick. Possibly the most famous of them all is Dererca, who was known as the sister of Saint Patrick. Now, there is some difficulty of trying, because there are some people who say that she wasn't a blood relative, that in fact she was a sister in I suppose in a religious context, but a lot of people believe that she was actually a real sister of him. Now, she's known as the mother of saints because most of her children, apparently she had 17 sons and 2 daughters, they entered religious life. Many were recognized as saints, and several of her sons became bishops. She, in fact, is honored, and she will be honored later this month on the 22nd of March. She's the patroness of Valentia Island, which is off the coast of County Kerry. So a few little things about Saint Mel, because he is important for a number of reasons. He was one of those who did evangelical work in Ireland, and he supported himself through manual labor. What's significant about that is that there was divisions within the church. Now, what had happened was that at the beginning of the 4th century, the Christian church, the Roman church, because there were a number of other Christian churches, you know, in the world at the time, but the Roman Church became the official. Well, first of all, it was decriminalized, legalized, made the official religion of the Roman Empire, and it was made the official religion of the Roman Empire just around the time that Patrick was born. The effect of that was that it changed the way that people, if you like, evangelized. The persecuted Christians, which they had been persecuted for nearly 300 years, they evangelized and proselytized essentially among the poor and among the population at large, and they did it at great risk to themselves because they were enemies of the Roman Empire. Now that they had become accepted, and not just accepted, but where they were the only religion that was now acceptable. And the Roman Church was the only one of the various Christian sects that was allowed to be called Christian. Everybody else were called heretics, and it was said that if you were a heretic, you were worse than a pagan. So Mel was one of those ones who then, because of they abhorred the fact that now the religion was being led by all of the leaders, all of the well-fed, rich people, because now the strategy was to spread the religion by essentially converting the leaders of society and getting them to basically make an edict to tell people, now you are no longer pagans, you are Christians. Whereas there were other people who still believed in the old way of doing things. And that was, in the case of St. Mel, that was why he made, his idea was, we will never be a burden on the people. We will earn our own way. So Patrick appointed him as one of the earliest Irish bishops and head of the Diocese of Arda. He was also involved in the building of a monastery, and he was both a bishop and an abbot, because at this time, the Roman Church wanted to develop the kind of parish system, the diocesan system, with geographic boundaries where you would have a fixed role for a fixed number of people. The other tradition was a combination of monastery work as well as traveling, if you like, traveling Christians. Now, the diocesan model did not like traveling Christians, because in the area it was given to certain people and they ruled the roost there. They didn't want people wandering in and interfering with that. So that led to various ongoing differences. And one of the things that came about then was that you had some people ended up being both a bishop and an abbot, because the monasteries became the center of the diocesan area. The diocesan area became an area that wasn't one where the geographic boundaries could be set by Rome. What they had to do in Ireland was accept that the diocesan boundaries had to be the clan boundaries. So again, it was an Irish solution for an Irish situation. One of the things that is talked about in relation to St. Mel was that it was him. Now, some books you will read and say it was somebody else, but I'm going with the ones who say it was St. Mel. He accepted St. Bridget's profession as a nun and served as her mentor while she was in Arda. What's significant here, a couple of things are significant. One was women at the time, while before Christianity arrived in Ireland, women's position in society was a lot stronger, let's put it that way, than what it was under the Christian way. Also now under this new situation where the church was coming from Rome, and it was from a hierarchy of rich and powerful men. Women's role was changing from what it had been for the first 200 or 300 years of Christianity. So the story goes anyway that Mel, because Bridget was having difficulty getting anyone to accept her into the church, so what he did was he accepted her, and when he read the kind of vows or whatever it is has to be read at the ceremony, he actually read the ones that were appropriate for making somebody a bishop. When this was pointed out to him that he had just made her a bishop instead of a nun, he said, "Oh, that's right. So what's the problem? I'm the vehicle through which God does these things. So I am not going to change that, because if that happened, it means that God intervened to make sure that that was the way it was." And that was accepted, and that continued to be accepted for the next, nearly probably 500 years, because at any meeting in Ireland of the leaders of the church, the descendant or representative of St. Bridget and her work was always there as an equal. Now, the Gregorian reforms began around the 10th, 11th century, and in the 12th century, when the Normans came in, at the time there was a pope who was the only English pope at the time. He gave Ireland as a gift to the English king. And when they invaded Ireland, one of the first things they did was they called a conference or a synod of all of the leading church people in Ireland to get rid of a number of things, because they didn't like the way that the Christian church in Ireland was working. One of the things that they booted out and kicked out of this, was the practice of allowing a woman to be at the meetings. So that tradition of Bridget was tossed out at that point. St. Mel, we has a feast day, February the 7th. It's observed as a holiday for single people. a day for singles to celebrate the good things about being single. And traditions include sending yourself a St. Meldays card, and of course, for people to host parties for their single friends. So that's just a short introduction. There's a lot more. I could do a whole, and I have done a full lecture on his family, but I just wanted to introduce you to a few of them. So now let's look at Patrick. Now he wrote, or there's two documents he wrote. One is the Confessio, and in it he tells us that he was he tells us that at the age of 16, he in fact doesn't tell us it was the year 403, because there are some people who believe it might have been 50 years further down the road, but I go along with the 403, and I go with the people who believe it was 403. He was captured by Irish pirates from his home in Great Britain and sent to Ireland to serve as a slave, herding and tending sheep in Dal Riada. Now, what was going on at the time, and the reason why he was captured by Irish pirates, was very simple. Remember, who were the Irish? The Irish were Celts. Where did the Celts come from? They came from Europe. And why did they leave Europe? Well, one of the main reasons that they left Europe was the Romans drove them out. So you can imagine in Ireland, one of the worst fears at the time among the Irish Celts was that following the invasion of Britain, that the Romans might invade Ireland. So the strategy that they came up with was to keep the Romans busy by aligning with the people who were in Scotland and attacking them from the land on Britain, raiding then the west coast of Britain, and of course also raiding the west coast of Europe. So it was a destabilization program, if you like. And of course, at the time, slavery was worldwide. So they would capture people, bring them back, put them on the slave market. Some of them they would allow to be released after the payment of ransom money. That was a big way of getting money at the time. But apparently, no one came at ransom for Patrick. So anyway, he was owned by Ri is the Irish word for king. At this time in Ireland, there were about 150 kings, if you like, small kings, middle kings, and one king at the top, the high king. So he was Miliach MacBaun, and he ruled some hills of Antrim. And Patrick, in his work, the Confessio, he tells us, and you can imagine if you're out on the hills there in the cold and wet and the damp of Antrim, he began to pray. And in the writings, he tells us that he had never before paid any or much attention to the teachings of his religion, despite the fact that his family were deeply in religion. He tells us that he didn't really believe in God and that he found priests foolish. So that's where he was, Slemish or Slieve-mish. So that's the first known place. The people who ruled at the time were led by people who eventually became known as the O'Flyns. At some point or other, the O'Flyns lost the F and became known as the O'Lyns. That's just a little segue. Now, according to legend, he came there after his capture. He worked there for about 6 years, from ages 16 to 22. Now, 16 to 22 is very important because that meant he missed out on his high school and his college education. And people of his, background and status within the Roman community would have been educated through that period. And what's particularly important is if you wanted to become a priest or become somebody working within the Roman Church, your education was very, very important. Now, the problem for Patrick, and it bedeviled him for a long, long time, was that he wasn't seen fit to be allowed to become a priest or a bishop because he lacked the skills that he should have got at those ages. Now, he spent a lot of time trying to make up for that, but it was always something that was held against him because it meant that his Latin wasn't very good. His oratorical skills wasn't good. His world history and lots of other things were not up to the level that was expected. So 6 years. Now, the Christian narrative is that it tells us that on the last night, he received in his sleep his first otherworldly experience. A mysterious voice said to him, "Your hungers are rewarded, you're going home." And we're told he walked 200 miles to a place on the southeast coast, probably Wexford or Waterford. Now, the reality is that, as far as I'm concerned, is that the reason because escaping anywhere, if you're a slave, is quite difficult. And there were ways in which they made it difficult. For instance, you were paired with somebody. So if either one of you thought of escaping or attempted an escape or did escape, well, then they would take it out on the other person. So again, that was what held people in place, that knowing that if you left, the person that you had been, who was your friend, because if you were living in the mountains, you got to know your friend very, very well. Now, what happened at this point in time was critical, because the High King of Ireland was Niall of the Nine Hostages. At the time, he was one of the most famous leaders within Europe. He was away raiding against the Romans, and he was assassinated in the Alps. Now, he wasn't killed by a Roman. He was, in fact, killed by an Irishman. He was killed by somebody who was sent there by the King of Leinster, who had a beef with the High King and the High Kingship. Don't attempt to go into the details of it, but all you need to know is that he was killed there. Now, that led then to, you can imagine the shock to people in Ireland at losing their king, and also in the way that he was killed. So that led to instability and a period in which there was a lot of jockeying around for position, people trying to extend their reach and control and power. And I believe that what happened was that Patrick, and hopefully whoever his friend was, were able to escape. So he tells us, or we're told, he was a fugitive slave and he was never intercepted, stopped, or otherwise approached, which was almost an impossible achievement. What he says in his book is, or in his letter is, "I came in God's strength and had nothing to fear." Now, it is likely at the time that he was supported by the equivalent of an underground railroad. We know that there was systems that supported, for instance, I said earlier, if you were captured as a slave and if you were important enough, there would be an offer coming then from your family to whoever had you for your return. In other words, a ransom would be paid. Now, sometimes that was ransom that would be paid to the High King. If they could tell that they had captured somebody of significance, the first thing was to monetize it. There were other lesser people then that would be, if you like, people would be sent over. There would be people then who would be able to use their connections to make contacts and whatever. So that in itself, was probably something that, I don't know whether it was illegal, but it was something that was a functioning way of doing things. But at the time, there were a lot of slaves in Ireland. Patrick tells us that there were, thousands of people came around the time that he arrived, and there were huge. The biggest, if you like, group of Christians in Ireland at the time were slaves. So there probably was ways in which they helped one another. But anyway, what's significant, of course, and it helped him eventually, was that when he was in Ireland for 6 years, he became fluent in the Irish language. He learned of Irish culture and history and developed an affinity towards the people of Ireland. In the evening, he wasn't, didn't got his face in a Facebook page or watching TV. He was discussing with whoever was around him, and they discussed all evening until they couldn't talk anymore. So everything was talked about, and it was a great learning experience for him. Now, when he arrived at the coast, he got a job. He managed to convince the captain of a ship to let him on board, even though it was a criminal offense for anybody to hire or to allow a slave to escape Ireland on a ship. Now, the boat was loading a cargo of Irish hounds, wolfhounds and various other hounds, for sale on the continent. Irish hounds were prized possessions in the upper echelons of particularly Roman society. And these hounds were very, very valuable. So whatever happened anyway, what we're told is that he approached the captain, he was turned away, then he went off and started praying. And then he tells us a short time later, he heard some sailors coming, shouting, "Come on board, we'll take you in trust." We know that he traveled for 3 days, and what they found was devastation. Now, they probably arrived in what would be modern day France, which was Gaul at the time. Some people say he arrived in Britain, but it wouldn't take it 3 days to get Britain. And certainly there wasn't devastation there. So the devastation on Gaul was the result of at least hundreds of thousands, possibly more, of Germanic peoples who were fleeing the Huns, and they were able to cross the frozen Rhine in the year 407. Every now and again, the Rhine freezes, and this provided the opportunity for people to go in huge numbers. These were pagans. They then invaded Gaul, went through, destroyed everything on the way to wherever they were going. So that meant that huge numbers of Christians that were living in Gaul ended up in Ireland. They would have come as refugees. They would have come as asylum seekers. Some of them would have had substantial wealth. And this was very important because we know that for the next 3 to 4 centuries, Ireland was known as the Island of Saints and Scholars. And the initial injection, if you like, of capital into Ireland that allowed that to happen coincided with the arrival of Patrick and his attempts to, if you like, get the Roman Church accepted as the one, if you like, church in Ireland. So that was significant. Now, what he tells us was they walked for 2 weeks, found nothing to eat, and then the captain taunted him and with words like, "How about a Christian? You say your God is all powerful." And the story then, he goes on, he tells us, he turned to him and said, "From the bottom of your heart, turn trustingly to the Lord my God, for nothing is impossible to him." And of course, just at that time, a load of pigs crossed the road in front of them. So that sorted out, because remember, there was no way they were going to feast on those dogs. You know, the dogs were more valuable than they were. Now, you know about the story about the snakes. Here's my take on the snakes. We know at some stage Patrick left that group who headed off, obviously, to Rome. We don't believe he went there. He wanted to get home. Now, he would have had a choice to turn around and go back over the devastated land where there was, you know, nothing really, or go around the coast. And if he went around the coast, around this time, there was an abbot, Honoratus. He was constructing a monastery on the island of Lerins, which is modern day Cannes, where the International Film Festival is held. But the only reason he got the island was because nobody wanted it. It was uninhabitable because it was full of snakes and various other reptiles. There is a book that's written about the island by a woman called Hamilton, and she writes that Honoratus was winning a reputation for driving its booming population of vipers into the sea. She writes that it is not impossible or unreasonable to assume that he, Patrick, might have sought refuge on Lerins. Note as well, if you take the L from the beginning and the S, you're left with the old word for Ireland, Éireann. I'm not saying there's anything of significance there, we don't know. But anyway, what I believe then is that when Patrick arrived in Ireland, and he would have been traveling around the country with, you know, a large group of people in his work. And at the end of the day, they would probably be sitting down around the fire, you know, talking. And he was probably, you know, probably one of his favorite stories to tell people was about the time he was on this island and he was hunting and clearing the place of snakes. Because we know there was never any snakes in Ireland. So the story doesn't make any sense if you try to consider it. What we were told growing up was that they weren't talking about snakes really, they were talking about pagans. But anyway, whatever. That's if you're talking about real snakes, it's probably something to do with Lairns. So he got back home, and he tells us a few years later, I was again with my parents in Britain. They welcomed me and all of that, and wanted him to never leave again. But because of his growing faith and all the praying he did in Ireland, he decided that his future should be in the church. He tells us that that decision changed his life forever. So he spent the next 20 odd years, because at this stage he would have got home probably, he was 22 when he left Ireland. It was probably about 3 years wandering around before he got home. And then he arrived in Ireland when he was about 47. So it was about 22 years when he studied and tried to make his way up in the church. Initially, because of his lack of education, they would only accept him as a brother. They wouldn't accept him. They wouldn't agree that he could become a priest, certainly not a bishop. But in the end, he overcame that and ended up being both. So the reason he got back to Ireland, and this is how he tells us that in his sleep, he saw a man coming, as it were, from Ireland. His name was Victoricus. Now, Victoricus was somebody that we know he had met in Ireland. Whether it was Victoricus was the person that he had been, spending his time with on the mountain, we don't know. But anyway, he carried many letters, and he gave me one of them. I read the heading. It says, "The Voice of the Irish." As I began the letter, I imagined in that moment that I heard the voice of those very people who were near the wood of Fauclute, which is beside the Western Sea, and they cried out as with one voice, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us." So again, as I said, the Confessio and his other works, we don't have the original copies. What we do have are we have writings that were said to have been a direct, if you like, copy of what he wrote, but it was centuries later, at the time when the Christian church in Ireland was essentially generating its origin story. So as we know, with origin stories, they need a hero. So Patrick got the top job there. We know as well that if for an origin story at the time, it had to match things that were written in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So things like miracles and all sorts of things about visions and God, talking to you in your sleep. These were all kind of common. So we don't know whether this was because it is likely, because we know every narrative, every origin story that's ever been written has always, if we don't have the original copy, we know that changes would be made. So if any changes were made to Patrick's original, words, this may have been one. But in any event, it was a way of telling us that he had a reason for coming to Ireland. So let's look at Christianity. Now, the first thing I can tell you is, if you talk to the Roman, I was born a Roman Catholic, and if you talk to the Roman Church in Ireland, and in fact, years ago when I was doing some study, I contacted the archivist over there to try to, asking him, can you supply me with any documents about the early Christian, history in Ireland? And he said, "Oh, yes, it all began with Patrick." And I said, "Hold on a second. There's all sorts of, works out there that tell us that there was Christians in Ireland long before Patrick." "Oh, no, it all began with Patrick." So, basically what they're saying is that all of the Christians who would have been in Ireland before weren't really Christians. They were heretics, because that was what you were if you weren't a Roman Catholic. And as I said earlier on, if you were, one of those Christians who was declared to be a heretic, that was worse than being a pagan. Anyway, we do know a couple of things. We know there's writings there that tell us things about the first century. And we know that there's reliable evidence that in Britain that the church was established there in the first century. Now, they said that St. James visited Ireland in the first century, and that on leaving, he left behind an organization to spread the religion, including his father, um, Zebedee. And in fact, even today in Ireland, you will hear people talking about Zebedee. I used to be wondering why, because it just comes up every now and again in conversation. It's a kind of a Dublin thing, that people refer to certain types of people or things as Zebedee, and I can never understand it until I found out about this part. Now, James, a couple of things are important about James. Well, if any of you drink Guinness, you know that it's made in Dublin, and to get into the factory, you go through St. James's Gate. Now, St. James's Gate was where people used to meet between around the 8th, 9th century and the 14th, 15th century, when they were going on pilgrimages to Spain. The reason that we're going on pilgrimage to Spain is because James is the patron saint of Spain. So you would ask, is there some connection? Why were they interested in him? Now, there are other reasons apart from the fact that James may have been in Ireland and set up the first Christian community, but also the link with Ireland and Spain goes back because the Gaelic Celts are said to have come from Spain. So there could have been a couple of reasons. Now, the other thing that's important is that the early Christianity in Ireland came from the teachings of St. John, who spread the word of Christ to Africa and Asia. And the combination of John and James, it's important because they had significant differences in the way that they practiced and understood the Christian faith, and than Peter and Paul, who were the Roman-based disciples. For instance, things like the dating of Easter. And the issue with the dating of Easter was something that lasted for centuries in Ireland after Patrick, had died. So so you have to ask yourself, well, why wasn't Patrick's word just accepted and the Roman dating accepted? Well, the reason is because there was a stronger tradition in Ireland that predated him. But you won't get that answer from the archivists that I talked to anyway. And then there were other things like the haircut, believe it or not, was another division. Now, there's Irish legends, and then there's annals. Annals are, if you like, diary entries that were there, and we know from them, from the legends anyway, that there's a connection with the death of the High King. Well, he was only a king at the time, Cormac MacNessa. He died in the time of Christ, and the story here is that I think I mentioned to you earlier on that one of the strategies of the Irish was to fight the Romans outside of Ireland, and also from Ireland there were mercenary soldiers who went abroad to fight against the Romans. Now, a commander, of the troops from this king, he was the King of Ulster. He was captured by the Romans. But the story is that the day that Christ was being crucified, that the Romans decided that they would bring out a representative of every country and have them witness this event. And this commander from Ireland was there. He arrived back in Ireland sometime later, and he went to Cormac and was telling him what had happened. And Cormac was so upset about it that he jumped up and down and ranted and raved. Problem was, Cormac had a piece of shrapnel in his skull, and from the jumping up and down, it moved, and he died from a brain bleed. So that's kind of recorded because Cormac MacNessa, if any of you have ever read The Táin, which is one of the ancient legends, stories, from Ireland with Queen Maeve and various other people. You may have read that ancient novel. It's but anyway, a few hundred years later, Cormac MacArt, who was also one of the greatest high kings that Ireland had, he died, and he said that he was killed by the Druids because he had converted to Christianity. So again, And just putting a few things to you to suggest that long before Patrick arrived, there was a Christian tradition within Ireland. Granted, it was minoritarian, but if a high king had converted, there would have been, it would be an indicator that it was, it was might be minoritarian, but it was strong. And of course, then you take John, St. John and St. James. Well, what are the two most famous Irish boys' names? Sean and Seamus, which translates into John and James. So who were these people then that were there before Patrick? Well, there were Albi, Declan, Kieran, Ibarus, among others. All of them were later elevated as saints. And they controlled particularly the southern Ireland, in particular, the province of Munster. Patrick never went there. If he went there, it was only by invitation. Patrick spent most of his time in Connacht and in Ulster. A lot of these, did not like the idea that somebody was being brought in from the outside and to be foisted on them as their leader and to take over their work. They did not like that. And that was one of the reasons why they only allowed Patrick in by invitation. And he had to accept that. Now, as I said, some of the early, Christian development in Ireland, it has to do with the relationship of Ireland to the Roman Empire, because Ireland had been fighting the Roman Empire. And if you think about it, you had Celts in Ireland who had been driven off the continent by the Roman Empire. They had been fighting for hundreds of years to make sure that the Romans didn't come to Ireland. Now here was this guy Patrick coming in, telling him, I'm going to save your souls and I'm going to change all of your minds. So you can imagine that would be a difficult job, for anybody. And probably the reason why he succeeded was because that there were so many Christians in Ireland, both as slaves and as refugees and asylum seekers. And maybe there was the wealth that was coming in from the asylum seekers and maybe some of the refugees was sufficient to persuade the Irish, authorities to take a deeper look at this, whatever Patrick was talking about, and that seems to have happened. Unfortunately, we don't have the depth of documents that allow us, to test that one out. But so let's have a look again at the Roman influence. As I said earlier, the Christians had been persecuted for hundreds of years. The worst began around 250 AD. When persecution became empire-wide. Then it ceased when Constantine became emperor of Rome in 313. Now, Constantine had been based in Britain, and Constantine had been declared emperor on the field by his troops. Now, this was an event that occasionally happened within the Roman Empire because there were lots of soldiers and people who supported the military abroad who did not like the fact that there was all these people in Rome sitting around, drinking loads of wine, getting big and fat, never risking their life for anything, but yet telling everybody what to do. So occasionally, particularly depending upon the way in which the military was treated, sometimes they would respond, and one of the ways they would respond was by putting up their own person as emperor. Of course, that created a problem. Now, if you want to be the emperor, well, you're going to have to take Rome. So you're going to have to get an army together, and you're going to have to march on Rome. So he was living in the Christian part of the world. He had to go through Gaul, which was Christian. So what I believe happened was that in order to get the Christians to fight for him and to take on this battle, he had to promise that if he was successful, that he would end the persecution of Christians. The official story that we're told is that Constantine again had one of these visions and heard things in his head. and that that God was telling him that all the soldiers had to paint the sign of the cross on their shields, and the various things like that. But I believe it was much more down to earth. Let's put it that way. I think the Christians fought for him because if he succeeded, he would end the persecution. Then he called the first synod in the year 325. And tried to bring all the different religious groups together, because I don't think he had understood the extent of the differences. He didn't manage to get them, to come together. In fact, at that first meeting, there was a fist fight between the leaders of some of the main Christian groups. The result of it anyway was he basically decided, I'm going with this group of Christians from Rome, and the rest of you better get on board, because if you don't, you're going to be made heretics, and you will lose everything that you've got. And that's what ended up happening. Now, a couple of dates that are important. St. Patrick was born in Britain in 386. The official Christianity was made the official religion just a few years before that, in 380. And then the Germanic forces sacked Rome in 410, and that was one of the reasons why the church actually moved from Rome to what became Constantinople after Constantine, obviously, in Turkey, in modern day. What's the capital city there? Ankara, is it? But anyway, that was the last time then that the German soldiers left. So they had been there from around 50 AD to 410, about 360 years in Britain. Then in 476, the Goth Odoacer, he forced the last Western Roman emperor to abdicate. In 380, the Edict of Thessalonica made Nicene Christianity. The meeting that Constantine had organized in 325 was in Nicene. So they called it after that. Those who agreed with the outcomes from that meeting were called Nicene Christians. So that became the state church of the Roman Empire. As you know, the term Catholic simply means universal. And so that's why it was given the name Catholic, because it was intended to be a universal religion. This provided the impetus then for church leaders in Rome to assert their dominance over the various branches of the Christian church around the world. Now, we know that Patrick came to Ireland in the year 432. So a very important event happened 3 years before that. In 429, the Roman Pope, he sent Saint Germanus, one of his leaders, to Britain. Because at the time in Britain, there was a Christian group led by, some people believe, an Irishman, and they had differences with Rome. The differences essentially were over original sin. The Roman Church was going with the original sin as Augustine had promulgated it, but there were other leaders, in particular in Britain, who just did not agree that God, in His wisdom, would have it such that unborn children would be stained with sin and could end up in hell. And of course, the outcome of that was eventually, after a lot of discussion, was okay, well, let's forget about them going to hell. They'd go to purgatory. So we know we had purgatory for what, 1500 years or something before somebody decided that wasn't such a great idea after all. Anyway, what happened here then was that St. Germanus worked out a deal with the British ecclesiastical authorities. Those who did not agree with that were expelled. And many of them came to Ireland. So now we have a situation, if you like, where there's already thousands of slaves in Ireland from various parts who are Christians. You have these British Christians being exiled to Ireland. Originally, the idea was that the new Roman Church would only be spread to areas that were part of the Roman Empire. And remember, Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire. So Ireland then had to become an exception to that rule. And the reason, of course, was that the Roman Church did not want to see a country become Christian and have a strong counter narrative, if you like, to the Roman one. So that's why they decided to start sending in people to Ireland. They sent in Palladius first. When he didn't succeed, they sent in Patrick. So again, there were a number of other ways in which Christians would have arrived in Ireland. One obviously was slaves. The others would have been Irish mercenary soldiers fighting either for Rome or against Rome, because mercenary soldiers by definition will fight for whoever pays them. So those may have been converted while away fighting, may have returned to Ireland with spouses and families. Then there were traders and other free Irish people who may have converted. And then, of course, we know that there was, these are the ones that we talk about, but there were more missionaries than these four. And then, of course, the refugees and asylum seekers that migrated following the invasion of the Germanic pagans. So then let's have a look then at how he managed to do the job of converting the Irish. As I said earlier, the fact that he was coming in to spread a word from Rome to Celts who had no good reason to ever trust a Roman, that was going to make his life difficult in any event. And given that not only was he going to bring something about Rome, he was also going to destroy the religion of the Ireland. Because remember, paganism is a very, very strong religion. So he tells us anyway, just to give an idea of his understanding of how precarious his situation was. He tells us in his writings, daily, I am expecting to be slain or set upon or reduced to slavery. And in fact, he tells us that there were 12 attempts on his life. Now, this is how Cardinal Cushing puts it. He says, it was in an era of alarming crisis that Pope Celestine I sent Patrick to Ireland, an era of confusion and disorder. And that, I think, says very concisely what I've been trying to get across to you in terms of what was happening in the world with the Roman Empire, the Germanic peoples invading and taking over, Christians being expelled, and a lot of them coming from Gaul to Ireland. So again, it would have been a very interesting place at the time. So what was his role? As I said, a short while before him, the Pope had sent Palladius. That mission failed, and Patrick was sent to replace him. And his primary role was to align the Christian community in Ireland with Rome. The way what we're told is that he was sent to Ireland to strengthen the local Christian community. Now, the strengthening, what we're really talking about here is him, if you like, bringing in the Roman view and getting that established. And as I said, the community was a mix. So there was all sorts of things, because none of the Christians that were there, if you like, really chose to be there. Apart, you could say that the ones who were exiled from Britain chose to go to Ireland, but obviously the slaves didn't. And a lot of the others, the refugees and asylum seekers, okay, it's, whether they chose or not, they had to leave where they were. Now, we know he spent about 20 years preparing. He was initially confined as a brother because of his lack of education, and they never let him forget about that either. And when I get back to talking about, his letter, because I started off with a slide where he started off his essay. So remember, they didn't let him forget about his education. He was finally made a priest and then made a bishop. And he successfully pleaded his case to be sent to Ireland. And I believe that it was the fact that he had been to Ireland, that he had a grounding in the Irish language, and understood the way things were done in Ireland. And I suppose the other side of it was they had nobody else. Palladius had failed. And the reason Palladius had failed was essentially, there was no way you could send into Ireland, somebody who if you like, was not what we might call a man of the people. There's a great scene in a movie that was made about St. Patrick in 1999, showing Palladius, who was used, to a comfortable life, arriving on the shores of Ireland, wading, ankle deep in mud, disgusted that he had to do that, and surrounded by all these Irish people who were laughing at him. Laughing at somebody who was silly enough, to walk into mud with all of these finery. So he was not going to make an impression, and nobody like him could. And of course, when Patrick arrived, he was when he arrived and got off the boat first, there was a pitched battle between them and people. And they were forced to get back on their boat and head further up the coast. So anyway, he was able to, I suppose, embellish his CD with the fact that he had, I suppose, he had skills or talents that nobody else had that might work. Now, the other thing, of course, was that when St. Germanus came to Britain and did a deal on behalf of the Roman Church with the British ecclesiastical authorities, one of the things that was agreed was that if anybody was to go to Ireland, they would have to get the approval of the British ecclesiastical authorities. The reality was that it was a rubber stamp operation. If Rome decided we're sending somebody, it was kind of a courtesy, if you like, that they had to have him go before their committee, but really they didn't have the option of saying no. But at the same time, they could do things about it. They could make the fact that they weren't happy about it known, and they did. So when he went around, then Cardinal Cushing tells us that when he arrived in a community, he brought with him a retinue consisting of never less than about 24 people, and often the number ran to 100. The group usually included an assistant bishop, a chaplain, several young men whom Patrick was preparing for the priesthood, a brehon, which is the Old Irish word for judge, to advise him on legal matters, builders, masons, smiths, metalworkers, chariot and wagon drivers, a cook, and most importantly, a brewer, and 2 table attendants. There are also a sacristan, 3 embroidery workers, and a palmist who would be the custodian of the sacred books. Now, it is thought that he supplemented his church resources, possibly with some personal and family wealth. We can't be sure of that. It is quite likely that the English authorities didn't, or the British authorities didn't fund him very well, and Rome may not have either. But anyway, it is known that wealthy Irish nobility, particularly women, did provide resources for his work. And this became an issue in Britain, partly because he wasn't sending any of it over to them. And when he made it known, his defense in one case was that he gave the money back, and basically they didn't like that either. But basically their situation was, you should have taken it, but you should have shared it with us. Anyway, if you've ever read the book How the Irish Saved Civilization by Cahill, he has a couple of things. He says that Patrick, because of his knowledge of the Irish language and culture, was sent to provide support to the Christian slaves and converts, starting in Northern Ireland. And I explained to you earlier on that that was the only place he really could go. He would have sought permission from a local king to minister to Christians in a given area. You had to do that because all the land was owned. So you couldn't just stray, there was no kind of free, if you like, passage to anyone. To go onto any land, you had to get the permission of the people who controlled it. He also would have sought assistance of local kings to move beyond borders. So then he would have gone with the equivalent of a reference, or somebody would have gone ahead and said, you should allow this person onto your line. We know that he converted some kings, and that made his work easier. And the first one that he converted was the king of the area that he had originally been a slave in. Another book by a guy called Freeman, he suggests that Patrick succeeded by using a slow, and steady approach with a careful eye on the practical politics of Irish society. In other words, making payments to the local kings to gain their favor and protection. And we know that from his letters. And of course, in a lot of situations, you get away with doing stuff like this, but you don't make it public. And one of the big problems that the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain had was the fact that he made it public. Significantly, in terms of his success in Ireland, was that he chose not to be confrontational or dogmatic. And he wanted to demonstrate Christian morality and principles. And he wanted to do that in the way that he approached his work. So he wanted to be an example of what he was preaching. Now, we know that Patrick, along with the other missionaries, they did manage to spread Christian teachings throughout Ireland. They did it by preaching, writing, and performing countless baptisms. For whatever reason, people love baptisms. Pagan religions, it kind of helped that pagan religions already related to transcendentalism, so talking about the hereafter and about your God, this was, was just a difference of degree. It wasn't like you were introducing something totally unknown or totally crazy. They already had their gods and they already believed in the hereafter. It was just a different version. So he also recognized the history of spiritual practices that were already in place, the nature-oriented pagan rituals, and many of them were incorporated into church practices. And for instance, a lot of the days in the Christian calendar correspond with important days within the pagan calendar. Also, his cross, it's renowned for coming up, and because it combines the native sun-worshipping ideology with that of the Christian cross, the combination of the two. So his achievements, well, we know he established bishops throughout Northern, Central, and Eastern Ireland. He structured the church by locating bishops close to the sites of provincial kings. The borders of dioceses had to correspond with the boundaries of the clan or the petty kingdoms. He was the highest ranking bishop in Ireland. He was seated in Armagh, and he made Latin the ecclesiastical language of Ireland. Significantly, there were no church martyrs from that time, indicating that the pagan rulers allowed him to carry out his mission. And the main reason that we know there were no church martyrs is because if you look at the Christian origin story in most countries, it's based upon the martyrdom. That's really because they're their heroes. And their martyrs are the ones that they focus upon. But here, they didn't have any. They had to take people like Patrick, who wasn't martyred. Another book by a guy called Hounds, he points out that in his Confessio, it reads, "For on more than one occasion, he alludes to persecution. He declares that he expects martyrdom, and he welcomes the prospect." And of course, at the time, Christians generally welcomed it because it was the one certain guaranteed way of getting into heaven was to be martyred. The fear for most of them was that they would somehow manage to do something wrong and 2 seconds later get killed and not get to heaven. That was their nightmare. But if you are martyred, it didn't matter what you did before it. If you are martyred, straight to heaven. By the time of his death, he hadn't. A lot of books out there tell you that he had converted the whole of Ireland, but he hadn't. And he hadn't reconciled the secular authorities either. He supported church officials, he created councils, he founded monasteries, and he organized Ireland into dioceses. And one of the outcomes of that in the 6th century that was that laws were even laid down, and it laid down a code of conduct for Christians towards their pagan neighbors. And it wasn't a code that says your job is to convert them. No, it was to live tolerably in a society where you shared things with people who weren't Christians. Now, Cardinal Cushing tells us a few things. He's one of the ones who does tell us that the whole island was Catholic, but we know it wasn't. we know that he consecrated 350 bishops, ordained over 5,000 priests, and built more than 700 churches. And those are things that are generally agreed upon. So you can imagine that in that 25 years, there was a massive economic boom in Ireland, such a boom that it lasted 300 years. So let's have a look at his writings. I know I'm getting on a bit in time, but his writings are important. There was two of them. The first one was a letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. Now, Coroticus was a king in Britain, and what had happened was that Patrick had been up to on the northeast coast of Ireland, and he had just baptized a whole village, and then he headed off to another village. On his way there, a messenger caught up with them to tell them that just after they left, that Coroticus and his soldiers arrived, and they took all of these newly baptized people away to the slave market. So, you know, all eyes were on Patrick then to see what he would do. Now, so he wrote a letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. Now, he shouldn't have done that, because protocol was that he should have consulted, or he should have got in touch with the British ecclesiastical authorities and asked them to intervene on his behalf. But he knew that that was going to take too much time, and he also figured that that the likelihood was that the church authorities in the area where Coroticus lived were probably under the control of Coroticus and would do nothing. So he needed to do something positive. So he decides, well, first of all, he sent people over offering a ransom. They were told in no uncertain terms, you know, you're not getting a ransom, and if you don't get out of here now, we'll be hanging on to you. So anyway, Freeman describes the letter as at once a decree of excommunication, a heartfelt plea, a carefully argued sermon, a word of comfort to his Irish followers, and a powerful prayer to God for divine justice. Copies were sent not just to Coroticus, but to church leaders in Britain and fellow Christians in Ireland. Now, we don't know what happened, whether it worked in the sense that, because he was appealing to Coroticus, he's basically lying and was, you know, you're a Christian, the soldiers are Christians, the people you've taken are Christians, so you need to send them back. That's the Christian thing to do. And the reason he sent a letter to the soldiers was because he believed that if the soldiers understood it, that they could put pressure on Coroticus themselves. The main problem, though, was that Patrick had violated, if you like, the protocols of the day, and they never forgave him for that. By this stage, the British ecclesiastical authorities were having, you know, issues with Patrick. You know, for instance, from their point of view, he had gone native. He was not. His accounting principles were not ones that they approved of, partly because, or mainly because, he wasn't sending them their cut of whatever he was making, because he was deciding he was going to put it into work in Ireland. So what happened anyway, after a number of years, they were undermining his work. They sent over auditors, you know, to talk to him, and he basically told them, unless you're here to help me clean out the pig houses, I have no time for you. So eventually they called him for a review. He was about 72, 73 at the time. He knew that if he went to England or to Britain at the time for a review, that they probably would not allow him to come, and they would replace him. And he wasn't going to allow that to happen. So what he did, instead of going, he wrote a letter, and the letter is the Confessio. It didn't have a title. He didn't call it that. It was just a letter. But it finishes. He finishes it by saying that the letter is his confession before death. Now, we don't know how long afterwards he died, or if he was, you know, terminally ill, and there's nothing about that we know. But anyway, he called it his confession, and that's why it's got that name. So why did he write it? Well, the church were angry over his letters. They called him for a review. His character and work were being attacked. He was accused of corruption, of having ulterior motives in coming to Ireland in the first place, and of course was stated to be unfit for the job. And of course, this all related back to the fact that he didn't have sufficient education. He was too close. In other words, he'd gone native. And then they called him a filthy little pig keeper. Another way of looking at the Confessio, it's a selective story. It's designed to show that he was chosen by the grace of God to serve selflessly among the Irish. So he went through everything: his boyhood, his slavery, escape, dreams, threats, etc., etc. They were all included to convince the readers that he, like the Apostle Paul, was selected by God and guided by him in his work. So this is what he says. This is, hopefully these are the words. And it's likely that this part of the Confessio is genuine. He says, "Listen to me well, all of you, great and small, everyone who has any fear of God, especially you wealthy landowners, so proud of your education." So that was the first dig he was getting in. "Listen and consider carefully. God chose foolish little me from among all of you who seem so wise and so expert in the law and so powerful in your eloquence." Because again, he did not have the background in canon law, and also he had missed all of the classes, in oratorical skills and the rest. So he's admitting, he's self-effacing in one sense. So he says, "He picked ignorant Patrick ahead of all of you, even though I am not worthy. He picked me to go forth with fear and reverence." And another dig here, "And without any of you complaining at the time, to serve the Irish faithfully." And what he was saying to them there was, I know what you were thinking at the time. When you did approve of me to go, you first of all didn't think that I was going to succeed, and you probably figured I'd be 6 foot under in no time. So he died at Saul, where he built his first church in Downpatrick in Ireland on the 17th of March. St. Patrick is said to be buried at Down Cathedral alongside St. Bridget and St. Columba. That's never been proven. Just a couple of little things about, because I don't have much time, I don't want to keep you too long, about St. Patrick's Day celebrations. The celebrations essentially began around the 9th century, and they began because what was happening in Ireland at the time was that the age of saints and scholars had come to an end when the Vikings invaded. Now, when the Vikings invaded Ireland, they set about destroying the Christian heritage that was in Ireland. Part of the reason, possibly the reason, was in the year 800, Charlemagne, who was the king of France, was made head of the Holy Roman Empire by the Pope, because the Pope needed an army, because the Muslims and the Muslim army were a threat, to him. So he set up the Holy Roman Empire with Charlemagne as king. The first instruction he gave to Charlemagne was to get everybody converted. So he sent out this edict, and essentially the edict boiled down to telling people, because there were parts of the world where Christianity hadn't at that stage come, particularly up in the Scandinavian countries. And it said, you've got two choices. One is conversion, the other is execution. So that was taken seriously by the Vikings. So they hated Christianity as a result of that. So when they arrived in Ireland, they set about destroying it. Now, what happened then was a lot of the Irish people who were in Ireland in the monasteries and the rest, those who survived, because a lot of them were taken prisoner and sent off and sold as slaves. Some of them managed to escape. So they went to Europe and they set up all sorts of monasteries around Europe. And then they came up with the idea of celebrating St. Patrick. So that's when the St. Patrick celebrations began around the 9th century. Originally, it was a 3-day event. Let me see if there's anything else in here. So his feast day was placed on the calendar in the early 1600s, and it became a holy day of obligation for Roman Catholics. But it is also part of the worldwide Anglican communion. And until the 1700s, it was celebrated predominantly in Ireland. Now, one of the things that was interesting in Ireland was during the penal laws, penal laws in the 18th century meant essentially it was a crime, to be a Catholic, or to, well, in particular, to display the fact that you were a Catholic or Irish. Now, because St. Patrick was also, honored by the Anglican Church, the Irish Catholics were able to take advantage of that. So they began to use celebrating, St. Patrick as a means of promoting Irish culture and tradition, which was essentially an act of defiance. But because the Anglicans were celebrating Patrick as well, they couldn't really say a whole lot about it. So what they did was they wore shamrocks at the time. Let's see. So in 1903, it became an official public holiday in Ireland. And just quickly going through these here. Then originally, people would go out and drink, I suppose. But then there was a law brought in that required public houses be shut because drinking got out of hand. But eventually that was repealed in the 1970s. So we know in the States, the first recorded St. Patrick's Day celebration was in St. Augustine in Florida in the year 1600. And then there was a St. Patrick's Day parade in 1601. That was organized by the Spanish colony's Irish vicar, who was Richard Arthur. And then there were celebrations in Boston and New York. We know in the siege of Boston that it's Washington's general orders for the day, the evacuation day, which was March the 17th, and they used St. Patrick as one of the codes. Let me see. So the only nation outside of Ireland that celebrates St. Patrick's Day as a national holiday is Montserrat, which is the it's called the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean. And it was originally, or at least in relatively recent times, populated by Irish and African slaves deported there beginning in the 1650s. So that's me finished on that for tonight. I'll take any questions that you have. I teach Irish history courses, and I have some courses in March and April. That's my email address. It's the simplest way to contact me. Now, the ones for March have already started, but you can still join. One is the history of County Down. I have two programs. One is a history of every county in Ireland, and the other then is a chronological history of Ireland. And in the chronological history of Ireland, I'm up to 1916. So I'm doing the Easter Rising. Then next month, I'm doing the history of County Antrim, which is the county that's beside County Down. And then I'm moving on from 1916 to the events in the immediate aftermath of that, which were the rise of Sinn Féin, and then in 1919, the beginning of the War of Independence. There's a movie that you can get. I recommend that you have a look at it. You can get it, St. Patrick on, you can get it, you can Google it. It's free. Emmett Bergen plays St. Patrick. It's quite good. It's quite good. There's a kids movie as well. And as I said, if you want the presentation and would like to have those references, make sure you get them. So thanks for hanging in with me. And I'll take any questions that you have. So Heath, have you any questions there I can answer?
So I'll invite anyone with any questions to go ahead and post those to the chat. There are a couple here. One I think you kind of already answered, but I'll start with it. If someone were interested in learning more about St. Patrick, could you give 2 or 3 recommendations for follow-up in terms of like books or I guess movies?
Yeah, if you can send me your email address, I can send you the presentation and I can send you some books. I haven't, got them in the back of my head at the moment, but there's just quite a few books that I can give you a list.
Sure. And just so that everybody knows, since I see a couple of comments here in the chat, We will send out a copy of the slides when we send out a copy of this recording. And Sean, maybe I can also send out that list of books along with everything else. Okay, so we have a question. Why did the Romans concentrate so much effort on converting the people of Ireland specifically? It seems like the person is asking, was it just general missionary focus? Was it related to local politics, or was it because Christians were being held as slaves?
The main reason was because, well, first of all, as I said earlier, Ireland wasn't part of the Roman Empire. So when Christianity was adopted as the official language, official religion of the Roman Empire, the intention was to spread it within those areas that were part of the Roman Empire. Now, what happened in Ireland was because so many Christians arrived there as slaves and as asylum seekers and refugees, and then others were exiled from Britain because they wouldn't go along with the Roman church on the issue of original sin. So the danger was that Ireland would end up being a Christian country that did not share the view of the Roman church. So they intervened to try to make sure that that didn't happen. So that's why they sent in their own people, Palladius and Patrick, and they probably sent in others that we're not aware of, to ensure that the Roman Church and its methods and its theology got rooted in the Irish people.
Okay, and there was someone who had asked if you have any thoughts about the legacy of the church code that you referenced about living with one's non-Christian neighbors.
Yeah, well, I mean, my own personal view is that, we should all live with one another regardless of what we believe, and just talk about what we believe in, and not just be trying to convince each other that we're right. We should just have a respect for what we all understand, and also everybody should have a firm basis for whatever it is they do understand. There should be an education process. There's no point having people believing stuff that's nonsense. So yeah, there should be toleration.
Okay, there was just one question from someone asking for your email address, so I did go ahead and add that to the chat for anyone who is looking for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Does anyone have any other questions for Sean? Go ahead and pop that in the chat.
Okay, well, if there's nobody there, I just want to thank you for coming along tonight, and I hope that I was able to to get across to you a little bit about the real history of the time, and to try to situate Patrick in what his role was. He was just one person in a world that was changing rapidly, and I also wanted to try to help to create the counter narrative to the church narrative in Ireland, which really hasn't changed. Hasn't changed in 1400 years. It's still the same story, and now we're the church used to be very anti-scientific. If you look at the things about the way that scientists were treated, whether it be Newton or various other scientists who came up with scientific views about the world. It's not flat, it's round. And then gravity means that we can actually live on a world that's round. We're not going to fall off into space, because originally, the flat earthers couldn't understand how there could be people on the other side, because if they're standing with their heads down, they're just going to fall off into space. anyway, when people tried to explain that, it didn't go down too well. And unfortunately, a lot of scientists either ended up under essentially house arrest or worse. But things have changed, so it's important that we get the real story out there. And I don't think there's much, there's nothing really sensational about the truth as distinct from what was being told, because nowadays people are not that impressed by miracles as they used to be. Now, people know there's a real understanding. Miracles were a good explanation when things happened that you couldn't explain. Had to be a miracle. There was no scientific explanation for it. We don't have to go with that anymore. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Heath, for inviting me. And if, maybe next year you consider I could do one on his family. I started off tonight with a little bit about the family. It's a very interesting topic. But so hopefully, folks, I'll see you again, and you can get a copy of the presentation. And if you're interested in my history courses, please contact me. And well, with that being said, I hope you all have a good St. Paddy's Day. And so I'll sign off then, Heath.
Sure thing. Thank you so much for your time and for
Okay.
your expertise tonight, Sean. And thank you to everybody for coming out. And once again, thank you to our co-hosts and co-sponsors at the Walpole, Westwood, and Dedham Public Libraries. I hope that everybody has a great night, and look out for a follow-up email with the presentation, the recording, and perhaps a couple of follow-up books that you could check out. Good night, everyone.